Thumbs up.
Okay. We can get started. Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming today. So we're going to have a presentation today by Rebecca Signor from class, the director of class, and she's going to talk to us about mediating the rhetoric of student success. She's given this presentation many times, and the last time you gave it was?
I gave it about 3 weeks ago at the National College Reading and Learning Association conference in New Orleans. Hey, it was a fun town, as promised, So as Janet mentioned, I've given this a couple of different times, and so I think, and I'm going to try not to wander because of the way the screen's set up. I always want to establish, manage some expectations about what we're going to talk about and what I'm going to share with you all. So some parameters for us as we go about the day. The first one is context. So this research comes out of some work I was doing on the rhetoric and discourse of learning centers specifically. So you're going to find me referencing language that we see a lot, that I encounter a lot in my work. Not necessarily here at Drexel, because we're going to talk about terms like remedial and developmental and how we assign that to programs and we assign that to students. But I was asked to do this because I think there's a very real intersection and overlap in the work that happens in learning centers and learning assistants and the work that happens in academic advising. And so to some extent, this is an invitation for you all to kind of think about how language works within the context of the work that you do with students, whether that is career advising, whether that is academic advising, and how that language influences perception of the field of your profession, how it influences the perception of the students that you work with, and maybe labels them in some particular way, how it influences their perception of what they can expect when they work with you. So it's a lot about sort of how language influences that, how, sorry if I'm going too fast here, how the language has come about. The other thing I want to clarify is that the intent of this is not to ever sort of police anyone's language. That is not the aim or the scope of this presentation. Rather, this is more of an overview of how discourse and rhetoric around student support has emerged, how it has circulated in the field, how it's been challenged, what the field or practitioners and scholars have done to confront some of the language and the discourse that they find to be problematic. So we're going to talk about a couple of different sort of techniques and interventions. And if I could stop hitting the wrong button, some of the interventions that we're going to talk about, some of them are a little bit theoretical, which again, I think there's a place for that in the work that we do. We do work in education, and a lot of us are scholar practitioners, so we are producing scholarly work around our everyday exchanges and experiences. So I think that's an important thing to acknowledge. So there's going to be some kind of theoretical stuff we're going to talk about. And we will get to more practical kinds of things. And that's where I really would invite some conversation. So I've asked Janet to flag me at 2:45 so that we can have a conversation about trends you notice, terminology you notice, things you've seen happening in the field around the language and the rhetoric, and just sort of open it up to our own discussion about that. So that's sort of the direction that we're heading. So just to give you a sense of our agenda, I'm going to start by giving you, this emerged from a research project, so I have some research questions that I was kind of working with when I was doing the research. I'm going to give you some historical context around language of higher education, specifically around student support and student success. We're going to do a really mini lit review, 2 things, which I don't know if that really even qualifies as a lit review when it's 2 articles. But I'm going to hold up sort of 2 articles as examples of places where they've looked into this language and sort of how it's been considered. And then we're going to talk about the rhetoric and the discourse around some responses to that language and some strategies that people have used. And that includes things like how we standardize language, metaphors that we use, and even some rhetoric that we reclaim and use for our own means. And then we'll save time for discussion and sharing. Sound good? Cool. All right. So historical context. So really my question was, how has discourse, which is sort of the exchange of language, and the rhetoric, which is the argument around or arguments around student success, how's that evolved over the course of what we know about higher education, and particularly in the American context. We could certainly expand this out, but for our purposes, sort of relevant things. So there's not, the work that we do in student success is not new. There's some pretty lengthy lineage to the work of student support. You can trace it back to 19th century preparatory programs, places like Harvard when they moved on from the seminary model. They had what they at the time called developmental sort of education, helping students prepare in terms of their skill work, like their writing, their mathematical, computational skills. So it's not like this is a new thing, but higher education in general has evolved, and it has always sort of responded to the changes that we see as a nation. And you see that with the 19th century preparatory programs from places like Harvard. You see that with the Morrill Act of 1862. That was the Land Grant Act that opened up higher education, where you saw things like A&M schools coming online. And of course, there's post-World War II, where we had this huge boom in higher education, where we have the GIs coming back and entering into higher ed in numbers that had never been seen before and in this context. And so this is a quote that I pulled from an article from Mike Rose. And one of the things I do have up here is a works cited of some of the different articles and resources that I'm pulling from. So if you feel like, hey, I want to go see where this is in the literature, I have that for you, and I can certainly, Janet, provide it to you if you want to send it around. But this quote about how higher education and access to higher education has changed really resonates with me, because in the way that higher education and access to higher education changes influences the way that we think about it, the way we work, and the way we talk about it. So colleges and universities have historically responded to the call for access to higher education by, and this is the quote, admitting in turn the sons of the middle class and later the daughters, and the American poor, the immigrant poor, veterans, and the racially segregated, the disenfranchised. Because of the social and educational conditions these groups experience, their preparation for college will, of course, be varied. And if their preparation is varied, so too, then must colleges adapt to that. And we've seen that, and that's the history of each of our particular disciplines. So the question then becomes, how does that history continue to resonate in the way that we talk about what we do? And why does it matter? Why should we pay attention to the way that we talk about student success, the way that we sort of code and label students and where they are on the continuum of learning? So what we're going to do is we'll begin by looking at a couple of articles, one by Daryl Close and one by a gentleman named David Arundel. The Close article is a little older. Arundel is still the second article we look at. He is still producing work in student success. Pretty actively, actually. And we're going to look at how they sort of call out the rhetoric as stigmatizing, in that the way that we talk about our programs and our students has an influence on how we perceive them. And they kind of confront that. And then ultimately what they end up doing in a lot of ways is advocating for more inclusive language. So that first article is More Than a Definitional Problem, Remedial, Compensatory, and Developmental Education. And that was in 1980, and it came out of a journal that is still produced in a sort of different way, but it's part of what was the National Association for Developmental Education. It's recently undergone a name change. But NAID, if you've heard of NAID, or if you've ever been active in PAID, which is the Pennsylvania Developmental Education Group. And what Close is looking at, and again, this is 1980, so we've got a little bit of history here. Close is looking at the trouble with the interchangeability, the kind of use of languages, like of particular words and terms, like they mean the same thing, when we know there's always shades of meaning with certain language. He was particularly concerned that when we aren't careful about the language that we use, when we talk about students and we talk about our programs, there's a lot of power that you give up with that. And so we have to be considering this. And so this was his sort of argument. Consider how you say and what you say, because there's a lot behind it, and it influences how your institution looks at you, how your students look at you, and how you look at yourself. So he specifically looks at three particular terms. He looks at remedial, he looks at compensatory, and he looks at developmental. And again, in context, this is 1980, so some of this stuff has continued to be challenged and has fallen in and out of favor. So remedial, when you hear the word remedial, what is typically problematic when people kind of identify that term as problematic? Why is that? What's sort of quote unquote wrong, for lack of better words, that people have pushed back on the use of the word remedial? Does anybody know? We don't really use it here very much. You may have at some point. Absolutely. So it's that idea that the root of the word is remedy. And so it's a deficit model sort of language. It's also sort of medical. There's an ill here that we're going to provide a remedy for. And that becomes a little problematic because what it does is it basically says to a student, you're not well, you're not right. And so we're going to fix you because we have a cure for you. And that cure is going to be sticking you in a long sequence of coursework that doesn't count for college credit, but you have to take while you're here, or math work that you have to do kind of skill, drill, kill kind of stuff. So that was his sort of first point, is that there's this curative connotation to the word remedial, and it also sets us up in a position where seemingly we are going to cure a student, or we are going to remedy them their problems. And that's a little problematic for the work that we do. And we still see, how many of you have students who come in and it sort of feels like the expectation is that you are the fix-it, right? And that can be problematic for the relationship that you want to establish with that student, which is, I don't want to fix everything for you, right? I would like to help you fix these things for yourself, advocate for yourself, etc. So remedial is problematic in that way. And it's also, it can be considered elitist. It's a deficit model. There's other issues with that. Compensatory is a term that we really don't hear much anymore. And it's problematic for a different reason. Compensatory, obviously, considering how we might compensate for something that a student doesn't have coming in. Does anyone know like the sort of the big problem with compensatory? Is that a hand or is that a no? Oh, okay. I was like, oh, don't you tell us? No. Compensatory was typically used in a really specific context, and it's often a racialized term where you are compensating, you provide compensatory education based on demographic information, so racial, socioeconomic in particular. And that's obviously problematic because you're making a huge assumption about a student's abilities coming in based on their socioeconomic status or their race. So compensatory has definitely fallen out of favor, but it is definitely something that was kind of culturally and socially constructed in a kind of dangerous way. And then there's developmental. This is a term we actually use a lot still, right? We talk about developmental advising. Developmental education is still terminology that is used regularly. In 1980, it's still sort of newish. It's something that you trace back to like the late 60s kind of as a genesis point for the word developmental. And then it really gains traction through the late 70s, through the 90s. We're still talking about it today. We're still debating whether or not developmental is the term that we really, really mean. And so in 1980, Close is looking at this and going, all right, developmental's okay. We can maybe stick our flag on that hill and say that's the terminology that we're going to use at that time. Now, there is debate even today about, is that the terminology that we really should be using? And we'll talk a little bit about why some people consider the term developmental problematic. Again, I think it's very situational and it's very much about the context that you're using it in. I think you may argue that in advising, the term developmental is not problematic. Then again, you may argue that it is. So we'll talk a little bit about how you might argue that. The other article that I was going to draw your attention to is a much more recent article. It's 2005. It was written by David Arundel. You're going to hear his name again. And it's terms of endearment, words that define and guide developmental education. So again, he's coming at this from a particular context, not from learning centers, not from academic advising, but from developmental education. So helping students to feel prepared and to be prepared to encounter and do well at college level work. So he's really interested in some of the historical stuff that comes behind it and the cultural shifts, a lot of which we just talked about. And one of his big arguments is that he's arguing that we really need to find some new language. Now, what's a little disappointing is that he doesn't give it to us necessarily in the article, but he's saying to us, kind of like I'm saying to you all, hey, we need to pay attention to what we say and why we say it, and sort of think about if it really says what we want it to say. So he's arguing for new language, and he does talk about resistance to the term developmental. So has anybody ever heard folks kind of push back against that term? And if so, what has pushed that at all? Is that pushback you've not heard before? I can tell you a little bit about where it comes from. So in some ways, people associate developmental, because developmental, we often use it in terms of like psychological development and like human development, but it is also a medical term. And so there's some of that like, oh, wait a second, are we towing into this sort of medical metaphor that we don't really want to associate our work with? So there's that resistance. And the other thing that you start to hear people say more and more, and you hear this kind of commonly now, is that we use developmental as a euphemism for remedial. That really over the years, as terminology circulates, it just becomes euphemistic. And we're trying to like make it sound like we're not remediating students, when in fact what we're really doing is just remediating students and calling it something else that seems a little bit more palatable. And that's absolutely an argument and something we have to consider as we think about how we talk about our work. Are we just switching out one thing for another because it's shiny, bright, and new? I think if you think about it, you might be able to think about terminology even in the fields that you work in, where you've kind of chewed on some potential words or potential labels, and you've thought, okay, do I really want to use this? And there's a couple that sort of come to mind for me. He actually doesn't mention this, but one of the things that when I was doing this research initially, I looked up to try and find sort of evidence of his idea that like, oh, it's just we're switching out one term for another, we just mean the same thing. And I found in January 2017, so very recently, the United States Department of Education published a white paper. And they published a white paper, and it's entitled Developmental Education, Challenges and Strategies for Reform. And I thought, well, this has some potential in it. I wonder what they're saying. And there is a paragraph in that really early on in like the executive summary of this white paper that says, although policies and practices were referred to by various terms such as developmental education, remedial education, and college readiness, they all consisted of strategies that help underprepared students acquire the skills and knowledge needed to move to college-level courses. In brief, the term developmental education or developmental course and remediation are interchangeable. That was 2017 U.S. Department of Education, putting it right out there. And so that kind of gives us some support to the idea that developmental might be a bit of a problematic term for certain contexts. And this is what Arundel argues, is he basically says we have to be careful, because what ends up happening is terminology becomes fodder for things like political agendas. If people are pushing a particular type of development, so there's a large debate, I'm sure most of you are aware of, around how when a student comes into college and may need some additional skill development in a particular field like reading or writing or math, there's different models that are available that maybe help a student move to completion of degree more effectively than a traditional, we'll remediate them in these courses that are pre-college level that they'll take while they're here but won't go towards graduation. There's a lot of sort of negotiation of that politically. Different states are trying different things. And so what Arundel kind of predicts, and maybe rightly so, is that if we're not careful about the language that we use, then when these things make their way to sort of national policy making, it can have an impact on how decisions are made. Because they basically say, it doesn't matter. These students aren't ready. It doesn't matter what you call them. They're unprepared. Or they're, quote, at risk, which again is another term that you see circulated a lot and can be really problematic. So that's Arundel's kind of major argument. And one of the things that he turns to, and this is sort of where I want us to turn, is he speculates, that if we look at the work that happens in a learning center, and we look at the work that happens in a classroom, and we look at the work that happens in an academic advising suite in a session, we need to try and find the places where there's overlap. Because years ago in NACADA, and I don't know if they still use the little catchphrase, but advising is teaching. And you'll see that. And that was sort of an effort to get advisors to think about their work as sort of the pedagogical independence, like how you help students sort of move to that self-actualization, that fully developmental moment, right? And so what he says is, we probably need to kind of continue to think about that. How does advising is teaching, tutoring, academic coaching is teaching, and then high impact practices that happen in the classroom? How do those things intersect and maybe those influence the rhetoric that we use. So that, like I said, is mini lit review, just two things, some different ways that people have grappled with and considered language and how it might be problematic. Okay, so we have these issues. We have language that we're not totally satisfied with. So what do we do? Is there a way that we can intervene? And people have been doing this. They have been trying to make some impact in how we talk about our work. Because, again, the hope being that if we can make an impact on how we talk about our work, how we talk about our students, that it then changes how our work is perceived. Because our work can be marginalized. Not everywhere, not all of the time, but there are times when it feels like the work that we do is stigmatized as less than, or not as important, or not lifted up in the same way that other practices in higher education are. And so one way that folks have tried to confront that is to think about the language that we use. So they've done a couple of different things. So one interesting thing that they've tried to do, and this is where Arundel comes in again, so the guy we were just talking about. The College Reading and Learning Association publishes a peer-reviewed journal. It's called the JCRL. It's the Journal of College Reading and Learning. And it's gone back a number of years. And one of the things that they have done every maybe 10 years is they publish a glossary of terms. And this is the third edition, 2007. There is a fourth edition. It is coming out imminently, like within the next 2 or 3 versions of the journal. I got my hands on it, but it's embargoed, so I can't share it. But I can tell you a little bit about it. Just don't tell anybody. We just put this on YouTube and tell everybody that I'm doing it. So one way, and this is like, you could trace this back, like if you do a history of dictionaries and you look at Samuel Johnson, what was Samuel Johnson trying to do when he created a dictionary? He was trying to standardize the English language. And so it's an option. It's something that we do when we create reference material like glossaries and lexicons and dictionaries. So, let's try it ourselves. Let's put a glossary together of language that we use that intersects with our work. Now, this is not just learning center specific stuff. There is information in there about pedagogy. There's stuff in there about advising. There's terminology around student learning. You can find information in this glossary or words and terminology in this glossary that will resonate with you, that you'll be familiar with. So in 2007, they do the third edition. It includes usage rules, so it kind of gives you some, just like a dictionary would. Here's when you would use this terminology and why. Doesn't do this for every single thing. Now the fourth edition takes this a little bit further. So here's where I'm going to give you like the insider info. The fourth edition, which I thought was, the way I got my hands on it, is they circulated it in draft form to one of the largest listservs for learning assistants. And they basically said, hey folks, everybody look at this. We're crowdsourcing revisions. All right, so we all had an opportunity to weigh in on what's included, what's not included, how it's explained. I thought that was awesome. I gave my 2 cents. I thought I would kind of had to, considering this work. And so they solicited feedback, they solicited comments. They basically said, if you think there's terminology in here that should come out, they're reticent to do that. They typically don't want to eliminate even terms that can be problematic, because it's important that we recognize that it's terminology that we have used in the past and that it is part of our history. We don't want to erase usage. So that was really an interesting choice that they made. Oh, sorry, too far. But here the big things, the big changes in the fourth edition are, there's a lot of challenging that happens around the binary sort of construction of how we talk about students in particular. So instead of saying, like they basically say at risk, try to eliminate it. But then they say things like, if you have a student who is struggling, instead of saying this is a struggling student, you would say this is a student who faces challenges with mathematics. Because learning is learning is a continuum and is not a binary construction. You can be multiple places on that continuum. I always give the example of me, where I was always a fine student when it came to English and reading and social sciences. And if I had to be placed into a developmental course in mathematics, it would have surprised absolutely no one. It didn't mean that I was a developmental student. It meant that I needed to work on my math. And so they talk about this idea that, students learning is a continuum, and students can and are often on multiple spots on that continuum. They may be a little further to the remedial or the developmental side of math, but they may be really advanced in another way. And so that's where they kind of challenge this idea of using student first language, so a student who, fill in the blank, a student who is enrolled in below college level math course versus saying a developmental student, a remedial student. So you put the student first language. That's pulled from psychology. That's not anything really uncommon. But that's some of the stuff that changes in the 4th edition. So one of the really practical strategies that we can all use is to try and sort of adopt student first language. Try to talk about the student who or the student that does X, Y, and Z instead of saying, probationary student, a student who is on academic probation. It's a very minor construction change, but can make an impact in how a student perceives themselves and how we perceive them. So that's a very practical strategy, student first language. And then kind of trying to conceptualize how students may be at multiple places on a continuum of learning. It can be a challenge, for sure. So that's one sort of really practical thing. Another thing that the literature sort of challenges us to do is think about the metaphors we use and adopt new ones. As an English nerd, I love a good metaphor. Lakoff and Johnson's The Metaphor We Used to Live By. I'm sure most of you have had to, at some point, maybe in an English class, read that. But metaphors matter because they really do construct our thinking around how we consider people and how we consider things. So there's a couple of sort of interesting metaphors that people have floated. Considering the idea that learning is a continuum, the rhizomatic metaphor. Anybody a botanist, horticulturalist, like to garden? Any of those things? So far, I've had one in every, Angie, yeah? So I've had one in every time I've given this. They go, oh, the rhizome root system. And here's my sad little picture of a rhizome, but there it is. So as a metaphor around either learning, as a metaphor of the work that we do, as a metaphor for our students, the rhizome basically says there's absolutely a root from which we grow or develop, if you want to use a developmental thing. But what we don't always see is that root system is really complicated, complex, and interlinking, and that it lengthens out. So we don't always want to fall into hierarchical thinking around our students, that if we can think and speak and talk about them in a way that recognizes that there is expansive learning that happens, not just vertical learning that happens, it may challenge how we interact with them. So, and that there's multiple points upon that root structure that development can happen. So like there's these little offshoots that grow, some of them healthier than others. But again, when you're thinking about what a successful student is, sometimes it's not the tallest branch that we need to be focusing on. Sometimes it's these little offshoots. And those offshoots can be thriving, important things. So it gives that idea of like the metaphor of expansion. It also tells you kind of how the terminology persists, why we still hear things like remedial and developmental, not so much compensatory, is because those things, they never really fully die into the background. They're always there, and we need to recognize that. So the rhizome is one metaphor that people use, and that idea of, there's a great quote, so there's an educational researcher, Chris Gutierrez, who I referenced a couple of times. She and several of her colleagues have this idea of expansive learning, which is that learning necessarily includes both horizontal, which is expertise across everyday practices. So the things that our students are doing where they're demonstrating expertise, not necessarily getting credit for it, but demonstrating the expertise. And then vertical, which is the stuff that we sort of recognize as they took a test and they did well, and they kind of climbed the hierarchy, they made it into the next class, right? But sometimes we really need to think a little bit more about recognizing their horizontal everyday expertise. We tend to lose that sometimes. It's just the nature of our work. We're worried about helping them move through a curriculum, right? And that is very vertical in the way that higher education is constructed. So it's a metaphor to think about. Another metaphor is the metaphor of liminality. This is pulled right out of anthropology. So Victor Turner, in I want to say the 1950s, puts forth this idea of liminality. And basically it's this idea that people have threshold moments. And it's when they're in that threshold where they're not what they were before, and they're not what they're becoming, but they're kind of halfway in that doorway. Those are really, really, really critical moments for individual development. Our students oftentimes are really liminal, right? Our first year students, think about Welcome Week is like one big practice in liminality. They're not quite yet college students. They haven't really, most of them haven't done a college level anything yet. But they're getting there. They're kind of in the doorway. They're in the threshold. And so that may challenge how we think about what we do during Welcome Week. So kind of meeting people when they're in that threshold. Learning centers, there's a great article, Barbara Sustein's Movable Feasts and Liminal Spaces. This is about writing centers in particular, but what she basically says is there's a lot of places where there's liminal space. Writing centers, learning centers, advising offices, where students are sort of in between. They're not in a class, but they're not in a classroom, but they're learning. And that the work that you do is kind of in between. You don't have a professor's rank, right? Or you don't have a counselor, some of you do have a counselor's degree, but you're doing sort of this work that puts you in between all of these expertise. So our work is liminal, our students are liminal, our space is liminal. So liminality is a really kind of interesting thing to consider. Sustein gets really into like pedagogy and how like practice happens. But there's a lot of liminality that's sort of betwixt and between. Think about liminality that way. And then the other interesting thing that people do with rhetoric all of the time is the idea of reclaiming and recasting. So taking back language, and this is very much tied up in power and power moves. So you can reappropriate language. You've seen this happen in a lot of social and cultural movements where you have women reappropriating slurs, right? Racial and ethnic groups reappropriating labels and using them as sort of positions of power, right? So they're recasting that. That is something that has some value in social cultural movements. I'm wondering if it has value in educational movements in the work that we do. And there's one example of that, and I'm going to go back to Chris Gutierrez, and that is talking about remediation and then re-mediation. And that little tiny dash makes a difference because it takes it away from remedy and puts it with mediate. And so it becomes less of this curative, palliative, medical connotation of the word remedial and makes it more about negotiation between things. And so this is a quote from an article from Chris Gutierrez, is more than just wordplay, mediation is it, involves the reorganization of instruction, learning, social relationships, artifacts, all the features that help influence, shape, and emerge in socially mediated interaction. The work that we do with students falls into this. It falls into instruction, it falls into learning, it falls into social relationships, it falls into social artifacts. And so what we may be doing really is rethinking that language, putting that little dash in between the re and the med, and helping students to kind of learn how to negotiate that. So I think it's danger. There's a potential danger there because you're like, oh, it's remediation. And I can't hear the dash. It sounds just like remediation. But I think there's a hope there. It's sort of symbolic, right? So what are some practical things we can do? What are some things that folks have undertaken that challenges some of the stigmatization, challenges some of the marginalization? So we talked about person-first language or student-first language, just a subset of person-first language. Using non-binary language. Things we can do really practically in our everyday. Look at the communications that we send out. Look at the letters, the notes, the portal announcements, the posters. What does the correspondence say? All of our student-facing resources. Templates that we provide. So looking at our advising syllabi. Looking at the syllabi in our University 101. How are things presented there? And are there ways that we can help to destigmatize the work that we do by presenting students with language that isn't marginal or that sort of empowers our work? We sort of recommend this kind of stuff. Rhetorical analysis, discourse analysis. Look at your mission statements. If your unit has a mission statement, look at it. Look at the verb that's used or the verbs. Look at how you talk about yourself and talk about your audience as well. Do you have a vision statement? Is it different enough from your mission statement? Do you not have one? Are you thinking about creating one? Some of us teach courses where we ask students to write these things for themselves and having those conversations with them about thinking about the verbs that they use, thinking about the nouns that they use to talk about themselves. Elevator speeches, orientation scripts, we get in front of students a lot. And it can become very, as I'm sure you guys know, you just kind of it becomes rote. You just sort of say the same. You have like a script that you just don't even realize you have. And then stopping at some point in the term or maybe in the summer when you have a chance to breathe. And looking at the way that you present information to student audiences in particular or to your colleagues. Do you have person-first language in there? Do you have non-binary language in there? Thinking about naming conventions of your centers and your programs. That's all stuff that matters to students because here we change names a lot, sometimes. We organize and reorganize a good bit. That's a lot of opportunity that is not always true for a lot of places. So you can sort of think through, okay, should our name be X, Y, or Z, and why, and what does it say? So these are different strategies. So in general, these are things you can do. Some folks, I know there are units that are doing some of this. I know there are units that are doing communication audits. There are units that are thinking about even how they've changed the way that they enter notes in ABT because it's a closed system, but other folks see it sometimes. So that kind of stuff matters. In terms of your own experiences with language, what language have you ever had that experience where you hear something and you're like, are we saying that now? Is that a thing we're doing? Is that a label we're using? And if so, what is it? And did it give you pause or not? I can think of a couple that I've heard recently and or over the course of our time. Whether it's how we label students or...
I will start. So we have, I work closely with Dr. Amy Edwards, who runs the Autism Support Program, and I run a summer program, and we have some of those students participate in it. And I've been trying to not say like I have autistic students in the program. I say some students in the autism support program are in mine.
Yeah.
Just like not even identifying anything, just saying the students are in this one program. I'm not making any assumptions about them. They're also in my program. So just like starting with a student who.
Yeah. So the student first language. That's a good example.
It's lengthy, but.
Well, that's the thing. Is it sometimes it's not necessarily like going to roll off the tongue.
Yeah.
But it's not really supposed to like roll off the tongue. That's not the priority, I guess, in the reconstruction of the language. So on the other hand. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I think there's multiple ways to look at that. There's disability studies, it's a whole discipline, right? It's a whole cultural studies discipline. And that's a reclamation thing. You're talking about reclaiming rhetoric, is looking at people who are abled versus people who are disabled, and sort of hidden disability and known disability. So I think there's an argument to be made either way. I think sometimes it's a matter of just saying, you know what, I don't know. I need to think about whether or not I'm comfortable or uncomfortable with that. There's lots of places, Drexel, it's the Office of Equality and Diversity, disability resources. I think that is that's an effort to show it as a diversity and equality issue. There's schools that call that access services. I mean, if you look at different institutions, they do label what would be considered disability support in different ways. But yeah, I think, and oftentimes it's a matter of just going, I'm sitting with the discomfort of this for a little bit and trying to figure out if I am really just uncomfortable or what's happening. I think that's a really good example. I think trying to be really intentional, this is something that I try to be really intentional about, is neurodiversity and thinking about students being neurodiverse, meaning that there's lots of different ways that we process information. There's lots of different things that impact how we process information. And many of our students who are in the autism program identify as neurodiverse. So that's language that is emerging. It is language that's emerging in the last decade. Other terminology that you're like, Jenny.
I noticed that some of the things in the counseling center label themselves as group therapy, and I always wonder about that because that labeling can be a barrier for some students in and of themselves that are like, well, that's not something that applies to me.
Right.
But if you talk about it in terms of, learning skills that
Mhm.
you adapt,
Mm-hmm.
which is the same thing, and I know it shouldn't matter, but because there is a hump for some students
For sure.
about even considering
Mhm.
going, I always feel a little uncomfortable with that.
One of the things that, and I think that's one of the places where the advisor has a lot of ability to sort of help students work through that conversation. Because if you're a little bit like, I'm not sure if I'm presenting this in a way that a student's going to be receptive to it, they may be feeling that same sort of like, oh, I'm not really sure. And having that sort of, that's the social relationship. That's the re-mediation, the social relationship part of it, where you've developed the trust with them that you aren't going to steer them wrong, but helping them say, hey, if this makes you feel uncomfortable, here's another way to reframe that. One of the things, and I use classes, I can use classes as an example for this. When I started, we had a much smaller, 6 years ago now, we had a much smaller, what was called then academic counseling program. And we made an intentional decision that when we rolled that out to the broader university to change the name to coaching. Because the stigmatization around that terminology. Also, the really big thing for me was I never wanted a student to think I was a clinician. I am not a credentialed clinician. And I don't want a student to come in expecting that. And so it was, for us, a matter of setting an expectation that was realistic and fair. And I felt, a little bit of an ethical issue. So even that, and that was a decision, I can remember having the conversation with Rebecca Weidensall saying, I know we're gonna have to change our website, and we'll have to change a couple of things on our, our handouts. And we had an opportunity to do it because we were rolling it out to a larger audience. And so once we started saying to all of you, hey, we're doing this thing called academic coaching, everybody got on board with it. Nobody questioned it. So it was good. We didn't have a lot of pushback. But same reason why, when we changed our name, and that was a lengthy debate about how we ended up with class, because we were the Center for Academic Success and we were the Drexel Learning Center. And that was multiple months of conversation trying to figure that out. Some days I wonder if we didn't necessarily do ourselves a favor with our really long name. But even that, we don't always get it right. I don't think it's terrible, but there's definitely people go, class is confusing. And we're like, yeah, it is. I understand that. So that's another one. Other terminology. Man, we're trying so hard here, right? I mean, wasn't there an email? There was an email, and we're shifting freshmen to first year, which is more inclusive, less gendered language. I think saying to folks, hey, we're doing this now, is one thing. It's practice, right? It's retraining ourselves. I think everybody had this experience if they came here from a school with semesters. You had to retrain yourself to not say semester, unless you really meant semester. And then most of us default to term, because it's just easier. But yeah, there's definitely a retraining. That's gendered language that has persisted in higher education for centuries, and we're moving on from, but we're still not there. We still do use the term freshman a good deal, I think. In our policies, we see it sometimes pops up. I think there's an effort to eradicate that, but it takes a while.
I think even student success.
It is, because there's so much goes into that, right? And we talk about holistic student success, because hopefully all that we do contributes to that in a lot of different domains. But it's really, really broad, to the point where maybe it doesn't say much anymore. Thank you.
Isn't the tutoring center
Mhm.
something that used to exist all over the place and people have moved away from that word?
I think tutoring is still absolutely part of the part of the vernacular, part of the lexicon of learning support. I struggle with it because it's a very specific thing. Tutoring is a very specific thing. It has different contexts, and if you take it out of like the U.S. and you put it in, the U.K., it means a very different thing. We offer tutoring. We have a program manager for tutoring. We have tutors, but we're not a tutoring center. That is a piece of our pie. But there are places where that's what they do. They are tutoring centers. And so they do still label themselves that. A place where I used to work that just changed their name. They were the tutoring, at Bucks County Community College, they were the tutoring center for 25 years, I don't know, something like a lengthy amount of time. But they started an academic coaching and a peer mentorship program, and they were like, you know what, this is our moment, because we're not, it doesn't no longer captures who we are. So sort of alignment matters a good deal. It definitely matters. There's other terminology that you hear pop up. There's sometimes, I don't know if Janet Daminger is going to get into this, because she talks about post-traditional. So I don't know if she's going to do it in the presentation she's going to do. But we talk about traditional students and non-traditional students. Who's a non-traditional student anymore? What do we mean by that? That was coded language, right? That just basically meant, oh, it was an adult, right? Well, technically, they're all emerging. I mean, if they're 18, they're an emerging adult. So that traditional, non-traditional is something that became, and it was very binary. You're either this or you're that. What if I'm not? So there's that. At risk, we talked about in the 90s, and you hear this is starting to creep back into the literature a little bit, the idea of someone not being at risk, but at promise. Again, doesn't necessarily roll off the tongue. There was a movement, but basically saying to a student, like, it's a more appreciative label than at risk, which assumes that the risk is the thing that defines you, not the promise.
Can we talk about gateway?
Yeah.
Gateway courses?
What's the problematic or stigmatizing about gateway courses?
When I think about that word, it just makes me think like it's an introductory course that just leads to many other courses.
Mm-hmm.
Like
That's it, yeah. Gateway course, gateway drug.
it leads you to something else.
Not great connotation. Yeah. Or that idea that what do gates do? They keep people out. And so, I think that's one of the arguments or one of the considerations around gateway as a term, that it came to mean high DFW coursework, and it was the washout course. It was the thing that kept you out. Well, it keeps people out, so we should be doing something about that? Or are we intentionally trying to be gatekeepers? Is that what higher ed is or should be? And again, so it starts to get these sort of, gateway isn't, it's metaphorical. It's like a rhizome. It's like liminality. It's sort of a metaphorical term. But as much as it lets people in, you can also keep them out. Other terminology. Other ways that you might consider things that you might take back, do, wonder about, talk to your colleagues about. Yeah. Yep. Yep. And context matters too. It's how you present it. That this is this a course that challenges, or is it a student who is challenged? He's challenged some of these things. This is sort of Daryl Close, whoever said euphemisms, Arundel. His thing that oh, it's great that you adopt this new language, but eventually someone starts doing wink, wink, right? Like, oh, you're an at-promise student, wink, wink. I know that means you're at risk. And so that's why we kind of constantly have to be taking the temperature on what we say and how we say it. The question of challenge and support being a model, again, everybody who's worked in higher ed has heard that model. That idea that, okay, are you challenging them or are you putting them at risk? And what does it really mean? So again, a lot of this is, let's think about it. Let's debate it. Let's decide how maybe we as individuals are going to use the language. Like I said, I'm trying really hard to adopt neurodiverse, and because I do think it's more inclusive, I think it's more representative. Does that mean that I still say that incorrectly? Absolutely. I try to say, if a student says to me, I have blah, blah, like I have been diagnosed with autism, instead of saying it's an autistic student who's been diagnosed with. Not that I would ever talk about somebody's diagnosis, but for our point. So it is not something we're going to go back, and again, it's not a matter of policing language, it's sort of thinking about what language means to us, how we use it, and how we can influence the way it's circulated. Doesn't mean we're maybe never going to eradicate freshmen from the Drexel lexicon, but we try, we have programs that are first year exploratory. There's a reason it's called that and not the freshman exploratory program. So I think we're getting there. We're getting better. That's definitely the naming of units and centers and programs. They matter because we do circulate language that way by talking about a concrete thing. So if your unit doesn't have a name or it's thinking about rebranding, stuff to consider. Other stuff. Questions?
People talk about students in terms of their plan being ahead of the time. Or referring to certain courses and determine what the student takes them as the trailer.
We do use that term a lot. And I think that speaks to the continuum thing. You might be off sequence, off the standard sequence, but it doesn't mean that you're completely screwed up, right? But if we tell a student you're behind, what's the reaction you get from the student typically? To Aaron's face. Oh my God, what do you mean I'm behind? How far behind am I going to be? How much is this going to cost me? Right? How much more? How long do I have to be here? Right? And so even like that, it's those little words that we really don't sometimes even realize we do. It's innocuous. It's so tiny, and yet has such a massive impact. And that you have enough students reacting to it that you go, okay, maybe that's a problem. Maybe we need to find a new way to say that. And I don't have an answer as to what the right way of maybe saying that so that it doesn't induce panic. Anybody have any ideas? I think we could probably get that conversation going, because I think it would maybe make the conversations you have to have with those students a little bit less stressful for them. They can hear you if they're not stressed about, oh my God, I'm behind. It's a competition. It's a race. I know it's not a race, but it's a race, and I'm in the back of the pack. Yep. Yeah. Yeah. And I know there's majors that are very lockstep that you can't necessarily deviate. I'm looking at my nursing faculty. I'm looking at my nursing advisors there. But, that there are other ways to earn a degree here at Drexel University. But that's definitely, that's a whole conversation, right? That's a whole term of conversations probably with a student. But that's why we're all here to help each other too. That's why, we refer folks to each other all of the time. And that's one thing that's not on here, but even thinking about how we talk about the referrals that we make. One of the things that we struggle with in learning centers is surprising absolutely no one. Students are referred to us oftentimes when they have faced an academic challenge of some sort. They're on or near academic probation. And so viewing coming to us as punishment or as punitive is something that's really why I started to do this research. Is I was like, why does that persist? And there isn't a solution to that, other than, I typically say to students, this is what the good students do. What does a good student do? They seek resources, right? And they ask for help. And they keep working at it, even in the face of frustration. And they're resilient, and they're agile. And they knock on everybody's door, or they knock on that one door that matters. So what does that look like for you? So this is what a student who wants to be successful or is successful will do. But that's the genesis of what, why this came about is I've worked in this field for 25 years, and for 25 years, I'm like, why? It's not punishment. We're so nice. We really think we're going to help you. But it's how we talk about, when I say to students, go see your academic advisor, I really can't just let that lay there as the referral. I need to talk through with the student what that means. So I think I'm out of time. Oh, look at that. All right. I have a works cited page if you want to like see where these articles are and what they are, and you want access to them. If you can't get, most of them I got through Drexel, some of them I may have gotten through a couple other places. If you can't find them, obviously your librarian is a great resource. But I also have them somewhere, so I will happily share them with you. But thank you.